welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing valvular heart disease. Okay, so we're going now on to the next pathological process that I want to discuss, which is Liebman-Sachs endocarditis, which is a form of endocarditis associated with systemic lupus erythematosus. So to begin with, I just want to discuss systemic lupus erythematosus for a bit, and then we'll come back to Liebman-Sachs endocarditis and we'll see what sort of valvular heart disease this can produce. So let's begin by writing down the name systemic lupus erythematosus. And obviously this is usually just called lupus. And it's a very famous disease because of a certain television program. So, systemic lupus erythematosus, often just called lupus, or indeed you can abbreviate it down to SLE. So all three of those names, the full name systemic lupus erythematosus, just lupus, or SLE, they all refer to the same disease. So as I say, it's a very famous disease, but what actually occurs in this disease, let's now go over that in a little bit of detail. So, it's not a particularly well understood disease. It is an autoimmune disease, we believe, and we think that its origin is similar to the origin of rheumatic fever. So if you remember back to rheumatic fever, you had to start with genetic susceptibility, the genetic susceptibility to be able to get rheumatic fever. So not everyone, we believe, can actually get rheumatic fever, and it's the same with systemic lupus erythematosus. We believe that you have to have genetic susceptibility in order to get the disorder, and that genetic susceptibility will control your immune system. It will be the thing that gives your immune system the ability to actually create this autoimmune attack and therefore give you the disorder. So, to get systemic lupus erythematosus, we believe you have to start off with genetic susceptibility, and then just like with rheumatic fever, you will get the disease once you've had a certain environmental trigger. So remember, with rheumatic fever, you had to have the genetic susceptibility, and then you had to be exposed to a Streptococcus pyogenes pharyngitis, where those Streptococcus pyogenes cells had a high expression of that M protein, and then that created the autoimmune response. We think the same thing is true for systemic lupus erythematosus. You start off with genetic susceptibility, which says that you can get the disorder, then an environmental trigger is what you need to be exposed to. That will cause you to launch an immune response, and that immune response will then be this autoimmune attack that causes the disorder. So let me just write a little bit of that down. So you start off with genetic susceptibility, so we think only certain people can actually get SLE, so genetic susceptibility, okay, and then you need to be exposed to a certain environmental trigger, so environmental trigger comes next, and then of course after that, you'll launch this autoimmune response which will give you the disease systemic lupus erythematosus. So there's a nice little flow diagram. Alright, so in systemic lupus erythematosus then, these autoantibodies that you get, and again it's antibodies that are believed to play the big role, just like in rheumatic fever. The antibodies that you get in systemic lupus erythematosus are directed against nuclear antigens, and we don't understand completely how you get these antibodies. We don't understand what this environmental trigger is at the moment. There are theories, but we still don't have a proper understanding. But what you end up with is antibodies that are directed against nuclear antigens. So these are known as anti-nuclear antibodies. So I'll write this down here. And for short, anti-nuclear antibodies are abbreviated to ANAs for short. So this stands for anti, that's the first A, and then nuclear, that's the N, and then the second A is for antibodies. So I'll just draw a little picture of an antibody so that I've got something to point at when I'm referring to antibodies. So remember, antibodies have the two identical heavy chains here in yellow, and then the two identical light chains there in red, and everything's connected up, like so. So here's a picture of an antibody. So, In systemic lupus erythematosus, you get these anti-nuclear antibodies circulating in the bloodstream, and these are directed against nuclear antigens. This is the reason they're called anti-nuclear antibodies, because these binding sites are capable of binding to certain antigens in cell nuclei of human cells. Now, what sort of antigens then count as nuclear antigens? Well, things like histone proteins, so nuclear antigens, these are examples. So I'll just move the screen over a little bit. So examples of nuclear antigens are the histone proteins, which DNA is wrapped around. So I'll remind you that there are lots of different forms of histone proteins, and they form complexes. So I'll just draw a basic picture of this. So here might be a histone complex, so made up of multiple separate histone proteins drawn as this little cube here, and then what happens is DNA wraps around these histone complexes, so, like so. And then it will go around another one after going around this one, so the DNA inside the nuclei is wrapped, inside nuclei is wrapped around histone proteins that form these complexes. So histones are an example of a nuclear antigen. In addition, DNA itself can actually become an antigen, so double-stranded DNA, which I'll abbreviate down to dsDNA. These are two major examples of nuclear antigens, and in systemic lupus erythematosus, for reasons that we don't fully understand, this is the bit that we don't understand here, how you actually get these antibodies. But we believe you have to have genetic susceptibility, and then you're exposed to some environmental trigger. You get the anti-nuclear antibodies, and these can be directed against these really important things inside the nuclei of all of the cells in your body, of course, except the cells that don't have nuclei, such as red blood cells, such as histones, and then double-stranded DNA itself. So you can probably already understand that this is very bad news. You've produced antibodies against these antigens that are present in all of your cells. So this disorder can produce major consequences all over the body. Now, in different people with systemic lupus erythematosus, you'll get different symptoms, so it's not the case that everyone gets exactly the same collection of symptoms, but I'm now just going to go over briefly some of the major symptoms that are associated with systemic lupus erythematosus that are consequences of having these anti-nuclear antibodies which will cause inflammation at sites. And by the way, the pathogenesis from here on in is going to be very similar to what we had for rheumatic fever. The anti-nuclear antibodies, these autoantibodies, will go all over the body. They will find autoantigens, they'll find self-proteins, these nuclear proteins or nuclear antigens, such as the double-stranded DNA, because I can't really call that a protein. They'll bind to them, form immune complexes, and that will mean that at that site you will then get an inflammatory response launched, because sentinel cells will be activated by the immune complex in exactly the way we described when we were discussing rheumatic fever. So this is going to cause inflammation at loads of different sites around the body. Right, so firstly let me start off with some of the major symptoms of SLE, and then we'll come on to Libman-Sachs endocarditis, which is the symptom of SLE, or I wouldn't call it a symptom, but the consequence of SLE that we're obviously most interested in here. So let me get another colour, we'll go to blue. So some of the major consequences then of having these anti-nuclear antibodies. The first one that I want to discuss, because it's probably the most famous consequence of SLE, is the malar rash, also called the butterfly rash. And this is going to result from inflammation occurring in the skin in the face. So this is the malar rash, also called the butterfly rash. So this is a red rash that appears on your face that has a butterfly shape. And the reason it's also called the malar rash is I believe malar comes from some old word in Latin meaning cheeks. So it's a rash that appears over the cheeks. So let me just draw a basic picture of this. So if this is someone's head, and drawn very badly, but never mind. Here are their eyes, and here is their nose, and here's their mouth. So now let me put the malar rash on here. So it affects both of the cheeks, and I think I'll go for a thicker pen. So it affects both of the cheeks, so you'll get a red rash on both of the cheeks, and then you get a little connection between the red rash on the two cheeks that goes over the nasal bridge, like so. So you get it going over like that, and that's thought to resemble a butterfly, because these are like the two wings of the butterfly, and there's the middle portion of the body of the butterfly. And this is why often the symbol for the disease lupus is a butterfly, because the butterfly rash is one of the characteristic signs of lupus. Now, you can get a butterfly rash in other diseases apart from lupus, so it is not pathognomonic of lupus. If you see it, it does not mean instantly that that person has lupus. There are other causes of malar rash, but it is one of the very common signs of lupus, and indeed I think about 50% of people with lupus do indeed get the malar rash. Okay, so there's one of the signs of lupus or symptoms of lupus. Let's extend this line and put on some more symptoms of lupus. So of course you're going to get all of the constitutional symptoms because you've got inflammation going on all over your body. Then all of those sites of inflammation are going to be releasing molecules into the bloodstream, such as the classic one to know the name of, which is interleukin-6, which will go up to the brain and cause fever. It will also make you feel unwell. So you'll get a fever. You will also get the other constitutional symptoms, so for instance malaise, which just means generally feeling unwell, and fatigue, which means tiredness. And this, as I say, is the effect of all of these mediators of inflammation which are going into the blood. And the classical one to know the name of, which we discussed earlier, is interleukin-6, which most definitely causes fever, but we also think it probably has other effects on the brain and causes you to feel tired and generally unwell, malaise. Okay, the other thing I should have said actually when I was discussing the malar rash is with lupus, it's a strange disease. It's very different in different people. Some people will get the symptoms of lupus continuously, and some people will get the symptoms coming on and off, so they'll get a relapsing, remitting course. So some people with lupus will have the malar rash continuously and will have a fever continuously and will feel unwell and fatigued continuously, whereas other people will get this in episodes. They'll get the malar rash coming and going, and I should just put that. So this disease can either follow a continuous course, so unremitting, where the symptoms occur continuously, or the symptoms can occur in a relapsing, remitting fashion. So relapsing means getting worse again, and then remitting refers to them going away. And then it gets even more complicated because in someone with lupus, where they have multiple different symptoms, some of the symptoms might be continuous and some of them might be relapsing, remitting. So it's a really complicated disorder. So all of the symptoms that I'm going to go through, if you've got lupus, you might just have a collection of them. You're not necessarily going to have all of them. And some of them might be there continuously, some of them might be there in a relapsing, remitting fashion. The malar rash, the butterfly rash, in some people it will be there continuously, in some people it will be there in a relapsing, remitting fashion. The other thing that I should say about the malar rash is that it is made much worse by the sun. So sun makes it worse. So let's say you're going through a time where you don't have the malar rash if you've got lupus. So at the moment you don't have your malar rash, and then you go to the beach and you get far too much sun, then it will appear after that. So sun makes it worse. It brings it out badly. Okay, so fever, malaise and fatigue are some symptoms now that we've been over. Other symptoms of lupus then. Another symptom is that you can get joint inflammation, just like we had in rheumatic fever, and this is quite common in lupus as well. So you can get arthritis occurring, and of course when you get inflammation in joints, you'll also get arthralgia, pain in those joints as well. Whoops. So arthralgia. And again, we can understand completely why that is. You're going to get inflammation there when the immune complex is formed there, and that will lead to the swelling of the joints, arthritis, and also pain there, which is arthralgia. Okay, let's extend our line even further. more symptoms. You can get the same thing happening in skeletal muscle actually. You can get myositis, which means inflammation of muscle tissue, and also myalgia, which is pain in the muscle tissue. So you can get the inflammation affecting skeletal muscle tissue, which is called myositis, and myalgia, which is pain in the muscle tissue. So, you know, these anti-nuclear antibodies, they're causing inflammation all over the place. And I think I'll change colour. I'm getting a little bit fed up of blue. We'll go on to green now. Okay, more symptoms then of systemic lupus erythematosus. We've had skin inflammation, we've had the constitutional symptoms, we've had joint inflammation and muscle inflammation. Let's now go to the effects that it can have on the brain. So, two major effects neurologically that it can cause. It can cause headaches, and it's not fully understood why it can cause headaches, and the main reason for that is that we don't really understand the pathogenesis of a lot of headaches. For instance, migraines, we have a very poor understanding of where they come from, and we think that the headaches that you get in lupus are very similar in nature to migraines. So you can get regular headaches in lupus, and also it can trigger epilepsy, so epileptic seizures. And this is believed to be because it will cause inflammation in certain areas of the brain, and those areas where the inflammation is present can then become epileptogenic foci. Okay, so seizures and headaches are two major neurological symptoms. Finally, one final thing that I'd like to go over is the fact that it can cause serositis. So I'll put this up here. So, serositis. Now this refers to inflammation of the serous membranes. In particular, it includes two different cavities that can become inflamed in lupus, which are the pleural cavity, and when that becomes inflamed it's called pleurisy. So this is the inflammation of the pleural space, and then also the pericardial space, and that's called pericarditis. So remember, around the lungs and around the heart, there are these cavities. So I'll just draw it for the lungs. So if I have I'll do it down here rather than trying to squeeze it up there. So if here are the lungs, so here's the right lung, and here is the left lung here. Then surrounding both of them you have the pleural cavity. So the lungs have the visceral pleura surrounding them, like so, and then that is continuous with the parietal pleura, which is here, and then that space in between them, that's called the pleural space, and the membrane is called the pleural membrane. And as I say, you've got the two different portions of the pleural membrane, the visceral pleura, which is the bit that is closest to the lung here, and then the parietal pleura, which is the bit around the edge. Okay, so inflammation of the pleural membrane, that's called pleurisy, and that will result in you having pleuritic pain. So pleurisy causes pleuritic chest pain, and this is a very horrible pain in the chest, and depending on whether you've got it bilaterally, it will be all over the chest. If it is affecting both lungs, if you've got inflammation of the pleural membrane around both lungs, you'll get pain bilaterally, and it's specifically pain when breathing. That's what pleuritic chest pain means. It means pain that's made worse by breathing, by ventilation. Now, pericarditis actually also results in pleuritic pain, and pericarditis refers to the inflammation of the pericardium, which is the fibrous sac around the heart. And embryologically, the pericardium and the pleural membrane are derived from the same sort of embryological tissue, which is why they're grouped together as serositis here. They're both serous membranes, and they're both mesothelial membranes. Just to draw a little picture of this, if I draw the heart just as a simple blob here, then the pericardium, again, is a sac that goes all the way around the heart, like so. And this hole at the top here is where, obviously, the great vessels come out, and this hole here is where the hilar of the lung is, or the hilum, rather, of the lung is. So you've got, again, a visceral pericardium, which is the bit that actually surrounds the heart, and then the parietal pericardium, which is the one around the outside, and then in the space between you've got the pericardial space. So inflammation of the pericardium is called pericarditis. This also results in pleuritic pain when breathing. However, pericarditis is characteristic because you can distinguish it from pleurisy because the pleuritic pain will be relieved by sitting forward, by sitting up and then leaning forward. So just drawing a little picture of this. If you've got your person, and let's say they're sitting up in bed here, if they sit forward, so if they lean forward in the sitting position, that will relieve the pericarditis pleuritic pain, whereas it won't relieve pleuritic pain that's due to pleurisy. So pericarditis is relieved by sitting up and forward, and it's made much, much worse by lying down. So relieved by doing this that I've drawn here, and aggravated by sitting down. Okay, so in systemic lupus erythematosus you can get serositis, where you get inflammation of the pericardium and inflammation of the pleural membrane. And again, this makes sense. We've got these antibodies, these autoantibodies, they will bind to autoantigens, form immune complexes in these places in the pleural membrane and in the pericardium, and then trigger inflammation there, and this leads to pleuritic chest pain. And the way that you can distinguish between pleurisy and pericarditis is by asking, can it be relieved by sitting up and forward, and is it made worse by lying down? If those two things are true, then it's most likely pericardial of origin, pericarditis, rather than pleural of origin, pleurisy. Okay, right. Are those all of the common symptoms then of systemic lupus erythematosus that I want to go through? I think that's all I want to go through. There are, of course, loads more. If you go to the textbook, you can find loads more that are less common. These are the really important ones to know about that can cause that can happen in systemic lupus erythematosus. I will just remind you that in a single person with systemic lupus erythematosus, you're not necessarily going to have all of these, and some of them can be continuous, some of them can be relapsing, remitting. Okay, right. So, let's summarise where we've got to so far. We have discussed systemic lupus erythematosus. We've discussed that it's an autoimmune reaction and that it occurs in people who are genetically susceptible to developing lupus when they're exposed to a certain environmental trigger, but we don't really understand what the genetic susceptibility involves at the moment or what the environmental trigger is completely at the present. What we do know is that it results in the formation of these autoantibodies, these anti-nuclear antibodies, antibodies that unfortunately have the ability to bind to nuclear antigens, and two really important examples of nuclear antigens that they can bind to are histone proteins and double-stranded DNA. These anti-nuclear antibodies will be circulating in the bloodstream, and they can produce symptoms all over the body. So they can produce a malar rash, which is due to inflammation of the skin over the cheeks, also called the butterfly rash. This is made worse by exposure to the sun, and this occurs very commonly in lupus. And it can either be continuously present or it can be relapsing, remitting. It'll cause the constitutional symptoms, fever, malaise, fatigue, because you've got inflammation occurring all over the body. It can cause inflammation in the joints and inflammation in the muscle, which will lead to joint pain and muscle aches. It can lead to common headaches, which we don't understand the origins of, and it can lead to epilepsy. It can also lead to serositis, both pleurisy and pericarditis, which both result in pleuritic pain, which is a horrible chest pain, which is made worse by breathing in and out. The difference, the way that you can distinguish pleurisy from pericarditis, is that pericarditis can be relieved by sitting the person down and then leaning them forward, and it's made much worse by lying down, whereas pleurisy doesn't follow that pattern. Okay, right. So there's a little bit of an introduction then to systemic lupus erythematosus. Let's now talk about Liebman-Sachs endocarditis. So this isn't particularly well understood, but when you have systemic lupus erythematosus and you have these anti-nuclear antibodies, it can actually lead to endocarditis, inflammation of the endocardium. And this inflammation of the endocardium is very similar to the infective endocarditis to look at, you're going to get vegetations, large vegetations that will grow on the surface of the endocardium, and this can affect the endocardium, the endothelium that's over the valve cusps. So let me just remind you of the vegetations that I'm talking about here. So we will draw the mitral valve, just for an example here. So again, we'll be looking at the mitral valve from above here. So here is the anterior cusp, and here are the three scallops of the posterior cusp here. So let's imagine that this endocarditis has affected one of the cusps of the mitral valve, or the endothelium of one of the cusps of the mitral valve. What you can get is a vegetation forming on the cusp. And I'll draw this vegetation in red. And remember what this consists of. This consists of endothelial cells have gone, so the endothelial cells are no longer there, and instead replacing them, you've got loads of platelets bound to the surface, and they're all bound together by a fibrin meshwork. So just drawing a little picture of this, let's put on the basement membrane to start with. So here's the basement membrane, and I'll put on a few endothelial cells. So let's say we've got a endothelial cell over here, one there, and one there, and then where the vegetation is actually present, which is going to be this portion in between here, instead of having endothelial cells, you're going to have lots and lots of platelets. So I'll draw these on here. So these blue things are all representing platelets, all bound together and bound to the exposed basement membrane. And then gluing them all together, you'll have the fibrin meshwork, which I'm drawing now here in purple. So loads and loads of fibrin fibres all over the place between the platelets holding them together. Okay, so this is what the vegetation consists of. And then underneath that, you're going to have a inflammatory process going on. So the cells underneath this, the sentinel cells in the connective tissue underneath, do not like this, and they tell the endothelial cells to initiate an inflammatory response. So you'll get an exudate forming here, and you'll also get white blood cells such as neutrophils, which I'll abbreviate to N-phi, and macrophages, which I'll abbreviate to M-phi. So neutrophils and macrophages will be under here. And this is what actually I mean by a vegetation, and this thing will gradually expand, this area where you've got no endothelial cells on top, but instead platelets bound together by fibrin meshwork, and then the inflammation going on underneath. Now, remember in infective endocarditis, the whole thing that's causing this is that there are loads of bacteria in this vegetation, and that the immune response is failing to actually get rid of them there, and that's what's driving the continuous expansion of this thing and continuing the inflammatory process underneath. However, the same thing happens in systemic lupus erythematosus for reasons that we do not understand. We don't understand why it actually occurs. Of course, the anti-nuclear antibodies are going to be involved. They must be binding to some sort of antigen. But what happens is gradually the vegetation expands, the endothelial cells are gradually being destroyed, you get more and more of the vegetation, more and more of these platelets bound together with fibrin meshwork. So I'll just draw it expanding in either direction, so the thing's going to expand in these two directions, and the area of inflammation underneath will get bigger as well. So that is what we mean by Libman-Sachs endocarditis, these vegetations that can form on the endocardium and on the heart valve cusps. And we don't understand exactly how the pathogenesis works, but that's what happens. Now, this can cause massive damage to heart valves, and the heart valves that are generally affected are the tricuspid and the mitral valves. So you don't generally see the semilunar valves affected. It's usually the atrioventricular valves. So the ones that are affected by Libman-Sachs endocarditis are the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. So these can get these Libman-Sachs vegetations growing on them, and of course these will lead to massive destruction of the heart valve cusps. The consequences are exactly the same as for infective endocarditis. It can lead to the shrinking of the valve cusps, because as the vegetation gets to the edges it can start to destroy the edges, so you can get the shrinking of the heart valve cusps, like so. So I'll put that as a consequence, shrinking. You can also get holes forming in the heart valve cusps because the vegetation can just destroy all the way through the heart valve cusp and therefore lead to holes. So you can get holes as well. And also, we're talking about the atrioventricular valves here, so you can get chordal detachment if the vegetation destroys the portion of the heart valve cusp where the chordae tendineae attach. So all of these things can therefore lead to the heart valve not closing properly and therefore can lead to mitral regurgitation or tricuspid regurgitation. Okay, and that's the story of Liebman-Sachs endocarditis. Let's now just summarise what we've been through in that final portion of the video. So, we've now discussed this consequence of systemic lupus erythematosus, which is Liebman-Sachs endocarditis, which is a very poorly understood consequence of systemic lupus erythematosus. The entire disease is poorly understood, and it would be much nicer if we knew more, but Liebman-Sachs endocarditis is particularly badly understood. What happens, however, is very similar to an infective endocarditis. You get vegetations on the surface of the heart valve cusps and also on the surface of the endocardium of the wall of the heart as well. It's just we're more interested in it forming on the heart valve cusps because, after all, we're discussing valvular heart disease. And these vegetations are exactly like the ones that you get in infective endocarditis. They are where there is no longer endothelial cells covering the basement membrane, and instead you have platelets bound together by a fibrin meshwork, a blood clot effectively forming on the surface. That's what we mean by vegetation. The difference is you don't have bacteria in this vegetation this time, and it must somehow be being driven by the anti-nuclear antibodies. Potentially they are attacking the endothelial cells and destroying them, who knows. But the vegetation gradually expands, and underneath where the vegetation is present you'll be getting neutrophils and macrophages and inflammatory exudate coming in there, and all of this fight will gradually lead to destruction of the heart valve cusp, and the heart valves that are particularly affected are the atrioventricular ones, the tricuspid and the mitral valves. The heart valve cusps of these two valves can start shrinking down, you can get holes forming in the heart valve cusps, and you can get chordal detachment. All of these things mean that those heart valves are not going to be able to shut properly. They might even start prolapsing back, inverting back when the ventricles contract, and therefore you're going to get blood flowing back from either the left or right ventricle into the left or right atrium respectively. And therefore it will cause regurgitation of that heart valve, and now you've got valvular heart disease. Okay, so that is Liebman-Sachs endocarditis. Thankfully, the incidence of this is very, very rare, especially now that diagnosis of SLE is improving and the treatment of SLE with steroids is now improving. And of course, steroids will be given for their anti-immune effect, their immunosuppressant effect, so to stop the production of more anti-nuclear antibodies to halt the immune response and therefore halt the formation of these Liebman-Sachs endocarditis vegetations and the destruction of heart valves. Okay, so we'll have a break here. In the next video we'll discuss our final pathological process that can lead to valvular heart disease, which is carcinoid heart disease.